another edition of The Writer's Dream. The Writer's Dream is a show where we interview authors who talk about their books, how they write them, how they publish them, and how they market them. You can find us on Facebook. Just look for The Writer's Dream. We are also on YouTube. We are also on ltv-eh.org. We are all over the place. And you can, if you're interested in asking me a question or being on the show, please watch the screen. Every once in a while, my email will pop up, lmf217@hotmail.com. So today's guest is Pauli Libsohn. Pauli's been here before. She's a repeat offender, as I like to call people who come back on the show.
Right.
And she has discovered a treasure trove in her home, in her original home, because her mother was an incredible poet and writer. And so, Pauli, tell us your story about how you first got involved with your mother and poetry.
Okay, well, it's a terrific story, and it started back in 1971 when I was a student at C.W. Post College. And I went to my creative writing class, and the professor gave us an assignment of writing a poem. And I said to myself, oh my goodness, how am I ever going to write a poem? I was in a complete panic. But then everything was going through my head, and I said, don't worry, go home, ask your mother, and I'm going to have her
So even
write
in
the
college,
poem.
you were having your mother do your homework assignments for you.
Well, no,
I
she
don't
never.
know.
Oh, I don't know. But I was in a panic. I did not know how to write a poem. So I had it all figured out that she was going to do it. Well, I got home, and I gave her my proposal, and she said, oh, no. She says, you're writing the poem. She says, and I'll correct it. So she said, okay. So that's what I did. And I wrote the poem, and I didn't know really what I was writing, and I titled it Imitation of a Poem. So anyway, she said it was perfect. She said it was fine. She said, go hand it in. And with that, I did. I went into class, handed it in, didn't give it a second thought, came home, and she said to me, go get your father. She said, I have a surprise for you. I said, what? She said, you gave me an idea to write a poem. And I said, you're kidding. And she said, no. So with that, my father and I sat in the kitchen, and she read us this poem called Duet. And my father and I looked at one another, and we couldn't believe it because it was miraculous. It came from nowhere. She had never written anything before. And we couldn't believe it. And she couldn't believe it either. And we said, it's fabulous. So with that, almost every day, I came home, and she said, I wrote another one. And this would go on for weeks, for months, and eventually for years. And she and I would sit at the kitchen table, and I would tell her, yes, no, you have to change the title, put a comma here, whatever. And then what happened is that one day I purchased a book of Robert Frost's poetry. And I was reading the poetry, and all of a sudden a light bulb went off in my head. And I said, you know, my mother's poetry is better than Robert Frost's.
Oh boy.
And with that idea, I went flying downstairs, and it was the middle of the night. It was about 11, 12 o'clock at night. And I awoke my parents with this big announcement. And my mother said, are you kidding? And my father was hysterical laughing, of course. And so I said, listen, I'm going to go get your poetry out, and I'm going to read it. And I made them sit up in bed, and they started to listen to me. And I started to read some of my mother's poetry, and I was comparing it all the while to Robert Frost. And then my mother said, you know, she said, you have something there. And I said, I know I do. I said, we're going to get together a manuscript, and we're going to send this poetry into a publisher. So what happened is that I got together a few of her best poems, and I sent them in with great expectations to these publishers, and everything was rejected. They said, thank you, but no thank you. And the reason is because my mother is an unknown, and they didn't want to take a chance, and also because she's a poet, and poetry just doesn't sell.
Well, and also poetry is now enjoying a renaissance, especially here on Long Island.
Yes.
There are more poetry circles and poetry groups and poetry readings than almost any other kind of literature, as far as I can see.
Right.
So it was a matter of timing, really.
Correct. So then what happened is that I said, we have to keep working on this manuscript. I said, choose a title. So she chose the title, Confessions of a Poet. I said, fabulous. And I said, let's get going. I said, because I promise you, we're going to get this published. And she couldn't believe it. So everywhere she went, she carried her pad and pen. Even when she was driving, she would pull over to the side of the road and she would write down a poem. And so then, unexpectedly, my father passed away. And she stopped for a little while, but then she continued to write, and she used that as a catharsis in order to get over my father's passing. And then what happened is that she passed away because she couldn't live without him. And then I took the manuscript that we were preparing, and I put it away in her closet, and I left it there for 3 years because I just couldn't continue. Then one day I went into the closet, and I pulled out that manuscript, and I started to go through it. And I realized that all those poems in there that she had written were really written about her relationship with my father. And when it started, all those years ago on the beach at Far Rockaway, when she was 12 years old and my father was a 17-year-old lifeguard. And she never let me know that this was what the poetry was about. I just thought it was beautiful, romantic poetry.
Well, she had to have a source.
That's right. But it never, you know, when you're that age, it just didn't dawn on me. And I didn't ask. I just knew that she was writing this gorgeous poetry and that she and I were in this collaboration together. So then I started to go through everything, and I found the title poem to the first book, which was Immortal Kisses. And I realized that she wrote that in commemoration of the start of their love affair on the beach. And what happened is that when she was 12 and my father was 17, she was a young girl on the beach. And she spent every summer at Far Rockaway. And then all of a sudden she meets him. And she said to herself, I'm going to marry him. And at 12 years old, all of a sudden to make such a statement, you know? So anyway, she had to devise a way of how to get his attention. So she realized that she'd have to do something quite out of the ordinary. And that was, she started to bring books to the beach. And
that is definitely out of the
ordinary.
For a 12-year-old.
Yes.
To try to get the attention of a 17-year-old boy. One has to say that your father was a unique individual to be swayed by such a thing.
Well, at first, he couldn't get away from her.
One can only wonder why.
Right. And then what she would do is she would climb up on the lifeguard's chair and wait for him up there with these books. Could you imagine? And what his friends must have thought. Oh, my goodness. So anyway, he had to listen because he couldn't escape. And gradually, she really interested him in these books, and he started to read them. And he would actually then look for her on the beach because he couldn't wait to discuss the books, which was amazing.
It is amazing.
Right?
It is
I know.
utterly amazing.
And so this went on for 5 years. And then every summer would come to an end. And she had to figure out a way to keep in contact. So she gave him books to read over the winter. And they exchanged addresses, and they would write letters to one another about these books. And that's how their relationship started.
Well,
and that's where she got so many of her ideas about writing these poems from.
Okay, so tell me about, you have the third book.
Yes.
Tell me just quickly the first two books. How and why did you publish them? And what was that process like?
First of all, I had made a promise to my mother that I would have her work published. And I was not about to break that promise. And that was my driving force. Then I realized what the poetry was about, and it was about her relationship with my father, and I wanted everyone to know about that, and it was so beautiful. So that was my driving force. And then I was stupefied, so to speak, at how hard it was to get something published. I never realized how much work would have to go into
Yeah.
it. Number one, I became the editor, and that is a tremendous job because I had to figure out how my mother would want some of her poetry finished, because I had to finish some of them. They were left undone, so to speak. Also, I had to choose some titles, and I had to do some of the punctuation. And I wanted to do it in the style in which I felt that she would want it. So I was agonizing over that. Finally, that came to an end, and I had to find a publisher. And the big publishers, I realized, were not going to want me. So then I tried the regular self-publishing companies. And I was really taken aback because they're like machines.
Yes, and they're also very expensive.
Yes, I
Yes.
couldn't believe it.
I agree.
And when you would call up, they're not interested in you. They're just interested in making money off
That's
of
right.
you.
And selling you a package.
Yes.
And then selling you another package.
Yes.
And another package. Yeah, I
Yes.
know. I've been through this.
It was terrible. So that went on for several months, and I was really, I got very depressed from it. So I took a break. And then what happened is that one day at work, a friend of mine was listening to talk radio. And it was WOR, and there was a radio show on, sponsored by Page Publishing. And they were interviewing their authors. And she couldn't get over it, and she was listening, and she took down all their information. She came down to see me at my office where I work, and she said to me, she said, "This sounds terrific." She said, "Let's call." So I said, "You call, you interview them." So she called, and she interviewed them. And she said, "This is perfect." So with that, I called them up. And they were lovely, and they're a hybrid self-publishing company. And they do not take on everybody. You have to go before a literary board, which I felt was terrific. So I acquiesced, and I sent them in the manuscript, and it took 4 months. And I went before the literary board. They approved it, and I was thrilled. And they don't try and sell you all these packages. They work with you, and they're fantastic. I mean, they're wonderful, wonderful people.
Yeah, see, that's good that you're happy with
Yes.
them. What's different about, I know the first 2 books were compilations of poetry.
Correct.
What's different about this book?
Okay, after I finished Immortal Kisses, Confessions of a Poet, I went through other papers of my mother that I had not come across before. And there was one box of poetry there that I couldn't get over that was really written just about my father. And that made up the book Songs of You, a postscript. There was another box there that I had remembered from my childhood. And I never ever thought of looking into it because it never interested me. Yet I would see my mother almost every evening taking that box to bed with her, with all her books, because books were such a tremendous part of her life. And she would be making notes, and I figured she was scribbling, and it never really dawned on me that any of these notes were going to amount to anything. And so I saw the box all the time. And then I forgot about it. And after my father passed, she had just put that box away in one of her drawers. And then when I came across the other box, I said to myself, let me look at the other box, which I did. And I opened it, and I was flabbergasted because it contained poetic essays that she wrote about books that she read throughout her lifetime. And I was in utter awe. I mean, I couldn't believe it. She never said a word to me because I realized it was just for her pleasure. And she never thought that these could be published or whatever.
But there's a tremendous potential for this kind of
Yes.
thing, and I think you've tapped into it.
Yes.
So what do you plan to do with this book?
Well, I thought that this book would be terrific for colleges and high schools. And so what I did was I sent them in to various school districts and to colleges. And what I couldn't get over is that Queens College accepted this book and my mother's other 2 poetry books to use in their curriculum and to offer their instructors to discuss with their students. And I was so thrilled about that.
Absolutely. That's,
Yes.
That is really.
I mean, that, to think Queens
these
College,
poetic essays must be
they're brilliant.
very impressive. And
They are.
Yeah, there you go.
No one could believe it. And what I can't get over is that so many of these books in here I never heard of. And I had to look them up to see what it was all about. And also, when it comes to high school, the high school districts were very impressed with it. And I've been lecturing.
And now you have a whole new career.
Yes, I
lecturing
do.
in high school.
Right.
And how was that?
And at college, too.
Yeah. So
yes.
I know you did one in Manhasset.
Yes, yesterday.
So what was that like?
It was so thrilling. The children were so appreciative, and they sat there wide-eyed, and they were just listening, and they just couldn't get over everything. And afterwards, they asked for my autograph. I was so impressed. I had finally made it. Oh, goodness, yeah. So I felt like a true celebrity. And I'm scheduled for others. And in one school district, they created an entire course to be taught around my mother's books. And I couldn't get over it. And I'm getting such favorable responses. And so many districts are interested. It's overwhelming what's happening with these books. Because I realize, I always knew that my mother was brilliant, but I didn't know how brilliant. And the publisher, Page Publishing, said to me, the difference between your mother and other authors is that your mother writes literature and the other people do not.
That's an interesting comment.
Isn't that?
Would you like to read something from that book?
Yes.
And explain what it is that you're reading.
Okay. Well, as I say, she wrote these poetic essays on different pieces that she read.
Yeah, different works of literature.
Right. And she did it on many different themes. And what I would like to do is I'd like to read you the first paragraph of one essay that she wrote entitled Lovers in Milton and Shakespeare. One a sonnet, one a play. And I just thought that that was brilliant. The very first paragraph just pulls you in. And it goes as follows. Cleopatra and Delilah existed in an age long past, but their separation from the present is fleeting. Ancient and remote, but not antiquated and obsolete, their image is fresh and alive in the heavy strokes of the author's pen. The page is impregnated with their beauty, the imagination kindled by these seductresses incarnate. Their high energies are released by the genius of authors who take us on a breathless ride through history, reproducing in durable material the moral and intellectual actions of these two undulating females. Their status in literature, like their beauty, has never crumbled and has withstood the light of modern tastes and reviews.
So if I were teaching a course in Milton and Shakespeare, that would be a great way to start and introduce.
Yes. And I think it sparks the students' interest because I don't think there's anything out there like this.
Well, you have a history book, and the history book will tell you about Cleopatra and Delilah. And it's very two-dimensional.
Right, it's
or
bland.
One-dimensional.
Right.
And then when you think in terms of these characters being put in a play or a poem or even a historical fiction, then they become three-dimensional characters, and you can relate to them. So that's what she's promising there.
And these pull you in, and it's refreshing because the typical textbook is not. It's just, as you say, it's just black and white. But this is uplifting.
You know, so-and-so did this, did that.
Yes.
But they never talk about how they felt about it, what it must have been like, because both of these women, when they came into their own, so to speak, were very young.
Correct.
And to be 17 or 18 years old and be given tremendous responsibility and notoriety.
Now, for instance, on this, she titled this essay, Venus and Lady Booby as aggressors in love versus Adonis and Joseph Andrews as unyielding partners. Now, who would ever think of such a title like that? That's brilliant. And again, Venus and Adonis, they're Shakespeare, and Lady Booby and Joseph Andrews, those characters come from the book Joseph Andrews by Henry Fielding. And to compare those 4 characters, to me, that's incredible. And I'll read you the very first paragraph.
Well, it seems to me that she's taking a more modern, not in the first one, but this one,
Yes.
A more modern work and showing that it has the same theme as
Yes.
something from classical Greek.
Yes. Now, most of these that are in this book, they all have to do with love, because my mother was all about love. So most of these books in here are all about love. And let me just read you the first paragraph. Venus and Adonis, these two stand like monuments to the personification of love and beauty. In art, larger than life size. In literature, fleshed out to breathe on the printed page. They endure in the mind as physically perfect creatures made for each other.
No?
And who writes like that?
No.
No.
Well, I imagine there are some people, but this is excellent.
Yes.
Excellent writing. And as a teacher, I can see bringing this into the classroom. And
it's dramatic. And again, the students are drawn in. And that's also why in this one school district, they decided to create a course around these books.
No, I'm very impressed by that. The fact that you've been able to take these books, edit them, publish them, really create them. You created them yourself, and then that school districts are interested in them. It's really quite a feat.
And it was from just